Sarah Martinez had always been drawn to dangerous places. As a humanitarian aid coordinator for Global Relief International, she had worked in conflict zones across 3 continents, bringing medical supplies and hope to communities torn apart by war. But nothing had prepared her for the humid streets of Mindanao, Philippines, where the scent of jasmine mixed with the acrid smell of diesel fuel and the ever-present tension of armed conflict. The morning started like any other during her 3-week assignment in the southern Philippine island. Sarah woke before dawn in her modest hotel room in Zamboanga City, reviewing the day's schedule on her laptop. Today's mission was critical, delivering vaccines to a remote village clinic that had been cut off from medical supplies for months due to increased militant activity in the region. At 28, Sarah possessed the kind of quiet determination that made her invaluable in crisis situations. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had seen suffering but refused to be broken by it. She had joined Global Relief International 5 years earlier, after witnessing firsthand the aftermath of a devastating earthquake in Guatemala during her college spring break. That experience had changed the trajectory of her life completely. Her local driver, Miguel, arrived at 7 in the morning as scheduled. A Filipino man in his 40s with weathered hands and a warm smile. Miguel had been working with international aid organizations for over a decade. He knew the dangerous roads better than anyone, understanding which routes were safe and which ones required careful timing to avoid militant checkpoints. "Morning, Miss Sarah," Miguel greeted her in his accented English as she loaded medical supplies into the back of their white Toyota Land Cruiser. The vehicle bore the distinctive blue and white markings of Global Relief International, symbols that usually provided safe passage through conflict zones. "Weather looks good today. Should be clear roads to Barangay San Miguel." Sarah nodded, double-checking her inventory list. The cargo included vaccines for children, antibiotics, surgical supplies, and basic medical equipment that would serve the village clinic for months. Each item represented hope for families who had been isolated by the ongoing conflict between government forces and various militant groups operating in the region. The drive began peacefully enough. They left Zamboanga City as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, following Highway 1 through rural landscapes dotted with coconut palms and small farming communities. Sarah used the travel time to review her notes about the village they were visiting. Barangay San Miguel had a population of approximately 800 people, mostly subsistence farmers who grew rice and corn. The nearest hospital was over 60 kilometers away, making the village clinic their only source of medical care. Miguel navigated the increasingly rough roads with practiced skill, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about the communities they passed. "That village there," he said, gesturing toward a cluster of houses visible through the trees. "They make the best mangoes in all of Mindanao. My wife's sister lives there." As they traveled deeper into the interior, the roads became more challenging. What had started as paved highway gradually gave way to gravel, then to dirt paths barely wide enough for their vehicle. The landscape grew more dense with tropical vegetation, and the sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the calls of exotic birds and the rustle of wind through palm fronds. 3 hours into their journey, they stopped at a military checkpoint operated by the armed forces of the Philippines. 2 young soldiers, their M16 rifles slung casually across their chests, approached the vehicle. This was routine. Sarah had passed through dozens of such checkpoints during her time in the Philippines. "Good morning, sir, ma'am," the first soldier said, examining their identification documents and travel permits. "Purpose of your visit to the area?" Sarah handed over her credentials and a letter from the local government authorizing their medical mission. "We're delivering vaccines and medical supplies to the clinic in Barangay San Miguel," she explained in her clear, professional tone. The soldier studied the documents carefully, then consulted with his partner in rapid Tagalog. After a few minutes, he returned their papers with a slight frown. "The road ahead has been problematic recently," he warned. "There have been reports of Abu Sayyaf activity in the area. You might want to consider postponing your trip." Abu Sayyaf. Sarah had heard the name repeatedly since arriving in the Philippines. The militant group was known for kidnapping foreigners, particularly aid workers and journalists, demanding ransom payments that often funded their separatist activities. Despite the risks, Sarah knew that the village clinic desperately needed the medical supplies they carried. "We appreciate the warning," Sarah replied diplomatically, "but the vaccines we're carrying are time-sensitive. The village has been without medical supplies for months, and children's lives are at stake." Miguel nodded in agreement, though Sarah noticed his knuckles had whitened as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. The soldier looked unconvinced but ultimately waved them through, adding a final warning to avoid any side roads and to return before dark. The last hour of their journey took them through increasingly remote terrain. The road became barely more than a trail, winding through dense forest where sunlight filtered through the canopy in scattered patches. Sarah felt the familiar combination of excitement and apprehension that came with reaching isolated communities that rarely saw outsiders. They arrived in Barangay San Miguel just after 11 in the morning. The village was smaller than Sarah had expected, perhaps 50 modest houses built on stilts to protect against flooding, connected by narrow wooden walkways. Children appeared from seemingly nowhere as their vehicle entered the village, their faces bright with curiosity as they gathered around the unfamiliar white truck. The village chief, an elderly man named Capitan Roberto, greeted them warmly. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile as he shook hands with Sarah and Miguel, speaking rapidly in the local dialect before switching to English for Sarah's benefit. "Welcome, welcome," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "We have been waiting for this day for many months. The children, they need the vaccines very badly. Come, come, let me show you to the clinic." The clinic was a simple concrete building with a corrugated metal roof, but it was clean and well-organized. Dr. Elena Santos, the village's only medical professional, was a young woman who had returned to her hometown after completing her medical training in Manila. She greeted the supply delivery with obvious relief. "You have no idea how much this means to us," Dr. Santos told Sarah as they began unloading the medical supplies. "We've been rationing our remaining vaccines, trying to prioritize the most vulnerable children. Some families have walked for days from neighboring villages, just hoping we might have medicine for their sick children." Working together, they organized the supplies in the clinic's small storage room. Sarah methodically checked each item against her inventory list, ensuring everything had arrived in good condition. The vaccines required immediate refrigeration, and Dr. Santos showed her to the clinic's solar-powered refrigeration unit, a recent addition funded by another international aid organization. As they worked, villagers began gathering outside the clinic. Word had spread quickly about the arrival of medical supplies, and soon there was a line of mothers holding infants and young children, all hoping to receive vaccinations that had been delayed for months. Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction that came with knowing their difficult journey had been worthwhile. "Would you like to stay and help with the vaccinations?" Dr. Santos asked. "I could use an extra pair of hands, and the children would love to meet someone from so far away." Sarah glanced at her watch. It was already past noon, and Miguel had reminded her several times about the soldiers' warning to return before dark. But seeing the hopeful faces of the mothers waiting outside, she found it difficult to leave immediately. "We can stay for an hour," she decided. "Miguel, is that okay with our travel schedule?" Miguel checked his own watch and nodded, though Sarah noticed he kept glancing toward the forest that surrounded the village. "1 hour should be fine, Miss Sarah, but we really should leave by 1 o'clock to reach the checkpoint before sunset." The next hour passed quickly. Sarah assisted Dr. Santos with vaccinations, helping to calm nervous children and ensuring that each mother understood the vaccination schedule for their children. It was rewarding work, exactly the kind of direct impact that had drawn her to humanitarian aid in the first place. One little girl, perhaps 4 years old, reminded Sarah of her own niece back in Colorado. The child had initially been terrified of the injection, hiding behind her mother's skirt and peering out with enormous brown eyes. But Sarah had won her over with a small stuffed animal she carried for such occasions, and the girl had giggled with delight as she received her vaccines. "What's her name?" Sarah asked the mother in her limited Tagalog. "Maria," the mother replied, smiling as her daughter hugged the stuffed animal tightly. "She says thank you for the bear." Moments like these reminded Sarah why she had chosen this path despite the dangers and difficulties. Each child they helped represented a family that would sleep better at night, a community that would be stronger and healthier because of their work. As 1 o'clock approached, Miguel appeared at the clinic door, car keys in hand. "Miss Sarah, we really should begin our journey back now. The road is difficult in daylight, and much more dangerous after dark." Sarah nodded reluctantly, saying goodbye to Dr. Santos and Captain Roberto. The village chief presented her with a small wooden carving of a bird, handmade by one of the local artisans as a token of appreciation for their visit. "This is beautiful," Sarah said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thank you so much." "You come back soon," Captain Roberto insisted, clasping her hand warmly. "You are always welcome in our village." They loaded their empty supply containers back into the Land Cruiser and began the return journey. Sarah felt the familiar post-mission satisfaction. They had accomplished their goal, delivered critical medical supplies, and made a tangible difference in people's lives. The vaccination clinic would continue operating for months thanks to the supplies they had delivered. The first hour of the return trip passed without incident. They retraced their route through the forest, with Miguel navigating the rough terrain carefully to avoid damaging the vehicle. Sarah used the time to update her mission report on her laptop, documenting the successful delivery and noting recommendations for future supply runs to the village. They were approximately 30 minutes from the military checkpoint when their peaceful journey was suddenly interrupted. Miguel had just navigated around a sharp curve in the road when he slammed on the brakes, causing Sarah to look up from her laptop in alarm. Ahead of them, a fallen tree blocked the road completely. The massive trunk lay across the narrow path, its branches extending into the forest on both sides, making it impossible to drive around. At first glance, it appeared to be the result of a recent storm. Tropical weather frequently brought down large trees in this region. "Strange," Miguel muttered, studying the obstacle with obvious concern. "This tree was not here this morning when we passed." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension as she examined the fallen tree more closely. Something about the scene didn't look quite right. The break in the trunk appeared too clean, too deliberate, and there were no signs of storm damage to the surrounding vegetation. "Miguel," she said quietly, her voice tight with growing alarm, "I think we should turn around. This doesn't look natural." But before Miguel could respond, armed men emerged from the forest on both sides of the road. They moved with military precision, their faces covered with bandanas, and their assault rifles trained directly on the Land Cruiser. Sarah counted at least 6 men, possibly more hidden in the dense vegetation. The leader of the group, a tall man with cold eyes visible above his face covering, approached the driver's side of the vehicle. He tapped on the window with the barrel of his rifle, his intentions unmistakably clear. Miguel's hands shook as he slowly rolled down the window. "Please," he said in English, hoping the international nature of their mission might provide some protection. "We are humanitarian workers. We are bringing medical help to villages." The armed man ignored Miguel's explanation entirely. In accented but clear English, he addressed Sarah directly. "You will come with us now. No resistance, no one gets hurt." Sarah's training with Global Relief International had covered kidnapping scenarios, but no amount of preparation could fully ready someone for the reality of being held at gunpoint in a remote forest. Her heart pounded as she quickly assessed their options, all of which appeared limited and dangerous. "We have no money," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're humanitarian aid workers. We don't carry cash or valuables." The leader's laugh was cold and humorless. "Money is not what we want from you, American. You are worth much more than money to us. Now get out of the vehicle, both of you. Move slowly." As Sarah and Miguel climbed out of the Land Cruiser with their hands raised, Sarah's mind raced through everything she knew about Abu Sayyaf kidnapping tactics. The group was known for taking foreign hostages to remote jungle camps, where they would hold them for months or even years while demanding ransom payments or prisoner exchanges from governments. But there was something else she remembered from her security briefings, information that now seemed critically important. Before leaving for the Philippines, she had been required to fill out detailed emergency contact forms. Among the standard next of kin information, there had been a section for military family members or connections. Sarah had listed her older brother David, a Navy SEAL currently stationed in Virginia. At the time, it had seemed like routine paperwork. Now, as armed militants zip-tied her hands behind her back and prepared to lead her deeper into the jungle, Sarah realized that this single piece of information might be the most important detail in her personnel file. The militants efficiently disabled their vehicle, slashing the tires and smashing the radio equipment. They blindfolded both Sarah and Miguel with rough cloth, then began marching them along a barely visible forest trail that led away from the main road. As they walked, Sarah tried to memorize every detail she could perceive through her other senses: the direction they were traveling, the sounds of their footsteps on different types of terrain, the scents and sounds that might help her later identify their location. Her training had emphasized the importance of staying alert and gathering intelligence even during the initial moments of captivity. The march through the jungle lasted several hours. Sarah's feet began to ache in her practical hiking boots, and the humid air made breathing difficult through the blindfold. Miguel stumbled frequently beside her, his labored breathing suggesting he was struggling more than she was with the physical demands of their forced march. Eventually, they arrived at what seemed to be a permanent camp. Sarah could hear the sounds of multiple people moving around, the crackling of fires, and conversations in various languages she didn't recognize. When her blindfold was finally removed, she found herself in a clearing surrounded by temporary shelters made from tarps and jungle materials. The camp was larger than she had expected, with perhaps 20 or 30 people visible in the immediate area. Some were obviously militants, carrying weapons and wearing military-style clothing. Others appeared to be support personnel, cooks, mechanics, and camp maintenance workers who kept the operation running. Sarah and Miguel were pushed toward a small bamboo structure that served as a holding area for prisoners. Inside, they found two other hostages: a German journalist named Klaus who had been captured 3 months earlier, and a Filipino businessman named Antonio whose family had apparently refused to pay the demanded ransom. "Welcome to paradise," Klaus said grimly as Sarah and Miguel were secured with leg shackles chained to a central post. "I hope you're comfortable with long waits. Time moves very differently here." Over the following days, Sarah learned the routines and hierarchies of the camp. Their captors were indeed members of Abu Sayyaf, a group that had been operating in the southern Philippines for decades. The camp leader was a man known only as Commander Hassan, who rarely spoke directly to the hostages, but whose authority was clearly absolute. The militants treated their captives as valuable assets rather than human beings. They were provided with basic food and water, allowed minimal hygiene facilities, and given rudimentary medical care when necessary. But they were also constantly guarded, their movements restricted to a small area within the camp. Sarah quickly established herself as a natural leader among the hostages. Her experience in crisis management and her calm demeanor under pressure made her someone the others looked to for guidance and support. She organized their daily routines, encouraged the maintenance of physical fitness within their constraints, and worked to keep morale as high as possible under the circumstances. Miguel struggled more with captivity than the others. The driver had never been far from his family for more than a few days, and the uncertainty about his fate was taking a visible toll on his mental health. Sarah spent considerable time talking with him, sharing stories about her own family, and encouraging him to maintain hope that they would eventually be freed. Klaus, the German journalist, had developed a cynical worldview during his months in captivity. He had stopped believing that rescue or release was possible, instead settling into a routine of survival that focused only on making it through each day. Sarah recognized the signs of psychological deterioration and made it her mission to help him regain some sense of hope and purpose. Antonio, the Filipino businessman, occupied a middle ground between Miguel's anxiety and Klaus's resignation. He had been negotiating with his captors for weeks, trying to convince them that his family could not afford the enormous ransom they demanded. His case highlighted the complex economic realities that drove many kidnapping situations, families bankrupting themselves in attempts to secure the release of loved ones. During their second week in captivity, Sarah overheard a conversation between two guards that made her blood run cold. They were discussing the recent capture of foreign aid workers and debating whether to contact the American government directly or to work through intermediaries in Malaysia who specialized in hostage negotiations. One guard mentioned checking the personnel files they had taken from Sarah's belongings, looking for information that might indicate her value as a bargaining chip. Sarah realized with growing dread that they would soon discover her brother's military service record. She was right to be concerned. 3 days later, Commander Hassan himself came to speak with her privately, pulling her aside from the other hostages for a conversation that would change the entire dynamic of her captivity. "We have learned some interesting information about your family, Miss Martinez," Hassan said in his measured English. "Your brother David is a member of the American Navy SEALs, is he not?" Sarah's heart sank, but she tried to maintain her composure. "My B. David Martinez was in the middle of a training exercise at Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek when his commanding officer pulled him aside. The SEAL Team 6 operator had been working with his unit on close-quarters combat drills, the kind of repetitive training that kept their skills razor-sharp for real-world operations. When Commander Thompson appeared at the training facility with an unusually grim expression, David knew immediately that something serious had happened. "Martinez, I need you in my office right now," Thompson said quietly, his tone carrying the weight of bad news. "Leave your gear with Peterson." The walk to the command building felt longer than usual. David had been a Navy SEAL for 8 years, long enough to recognize the signs when a family emergency was about to disrupt his carefully ordered military life. His mind immediately went to his parents in Colorado, or perhaps his younger sister Sarah, who was always traveling to dangerous places for her humanitarian work. Commander Thompson closed his office door and gestured for David to sit down. The older man had led SEAL operations for over 15 years, and David had never seen him look quite so serious outside of actual combat situations. "David, I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your sister," Thompson began, consulting a classified document on his desk. "Sarah was kidnapped yesterday in the Philippines while delivering medical supplies to a remote village. She's being held by Abu Sayyaf militants in the Mindanao region." The words hit David like a physical blow. Sarah kidnapped. Abu Sayyaf. The terrorist organization was well known among special operations forces for their brutal treatment of hostages and their willingness to execute captives when their demands weren't met. David's training kicked in immediately, suppressing his emotional response and focusing on gathering tactical information. "What do we know about the circumstances?" David asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "Who else was taken? What are their demands?" Thompson handed him a briefing folder marked with the highest classification levels. "Your sister was traveling with a local driver named Miguel Santos to deliver medical supplies to a village clinic. They were taken on a remote road about 60 kilometers from Zamboanga City. Initial intelligence suggests there were at least 6 kidnappers, possibly more, and they're holding the hostages in a camp somewhere in the jungle interior." David opened the folder and began studying the maps, photographs, and intelligence reports inside. His training had taught him to compartmentalize personal emotions during operational planning. But seeing his sister's photograph attached to a hostage situation report made his jaw clench involuntarily. "There's more," Thompson continued, his tone becoming even more grave. "The kidnappers have specifically mentioned your military service in their communications with Philippine authorities. They know Sarah is a SEAL's sister, and they're using that information to increase their demands." This changed everything. David understood immediately that his sister's connection to Special Operations Forces would make her both more valuable and more vulnerable. Abu Sayyaf had learned over the years that American military families generated more media attention and political pressure, which could translate into higher ransom payments or prisoner exchanges. "What's the official response going to be?" David asked, though he already suspected the answer. "State Department is working through diplomatic channels with the Philippine government," Thompson replied. "FBI is coordinating with local authorities on the intelligence gathering. But, you know the policy. The United States does not negotiate with terrorists, and we don't pay ransoms." David nodded grimly. The policy was sound from a strategic perspective, designed to prevent encouraging more kidnappings of Americans abroad. But when the hostage was your own sister, the abstract principle became painfully personal. "However," Thompson continued, lowering his voice, there may be other options worth exploring. I've been in contact with JSOC about the possibility of a direct action mission. The Philippine government has been cooperative with American counterterrorism operations in the region. Joint Special Operations Command. Direct action. David felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. A rescue mission would be incredibly dangerous, not just for the operators involved, but especially for the hostages. Abu Sayyaf had a documented history of executing captives at the first sign of rescue attempts. I want to be involved, David said without hesitation. Whatever mission gets planned, I need to be part of it. Thompson shook his head firmly. Absolutely not. You're too close to this situation, David. You know better than anyone that personal involvement compromises operational effectiveness. If we move forward with a rescue mission, you'll be consulted for intelligence and planning, but you won't be on the ground. David wanted to argue, but he knew his commander was right. SEAL training emphasized the importance of emotional detachment during operations. Having a team member whose sister was among the hostages would introduce unacceptable variables into an already extremely dangerous mission. I understand, sir, David replied, though every instinct screamed against accepting a passive role while Sarah remained in danger. What can I do to help from here? Right now, we gather intelligence, Thompson explained. You know your sister better than anyone. Her habits, her training, her psychological resilience. That information could be crucial for planning any potential rescue operation. Over the following days, David threw himself into research and planning with the focused intensity that had made him an elite special operator. He studied everything available about Abu Sayyaf's historical operations, their camp structures, their tactical capabilities, and their methods for holding hostages. He analyzed satellite imagery of the Mindanao region, identifying potential camp locations and escape routes. More importantly, he provided detailed information about Sarah's background and capabilities to the intelligence analysts working on the case. His sister's experience in crisis zones, her language skills, her physical fitness, and her psychological resilience would all factor into any rescue planning. Sarah wasn't just another helpless civilian. Her humanitarian work had given her skills that might help her survive captivity and assist in her own rescue. The intelligence picture began to develop over Sarah's first week in captivity. Philippine military sources provided information about recent Abu Sayyaf movements in the region. American signals intelligence identified communications patterns that suggested the location of the militants' base camp. Satellite surveillance detected heat signatures and movement patterns consistent with a permanent encampment in the dense jungle interior. Most importantly, the kidnappers made contact with authorities. Their demands were exactly what David had expected, a combination of ransom money, the release of imprisoned militants from Philippine jails, and the withdrawal of American military advisors from the region. The demands were clearly designed to be unacceptable to both governments, suggesting that Abu Sayyaf was more interested in making political statements than in actually negotiating Sarah's release. David found the waiting almost unbearable. Every day that passed increased the risk to Sarah and the other hostages. He knew from studying previous cases that Abu Sayyaf's patience was limited. When their demands weren't met quickly, they often resorted to violence to increase pressure on governments and families. His parents called daily, desperate for updates, and increasingly frustrated with the lack of visible progress. David found himself in the impossible position of trying to reassure them while knowing that the situation was extremely dangerous and that there were no easy solutions. Why can't the military just go get her? His mother asked during one particularly difficult phone call. You're Navy SEALs. Isn't this exactly what you're trained for? David wished he could explain the complexities involved in international rescue operations, the diplomatic considerations, the intelligence requirements, and the extreme risks to hostages during assault operations. Instead, he simply assured his parents that every possible option was being explored. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Sarah was learning to survive in captivity while carefully observing her captors and looking for any opportunity to gather intelligence or improve her situation. David didn't know it yet, but his sister was proving to be far more resilient and resourceful than even he had expected. The breakthrough came during Sarah's second week in captivity. Philippine intelligence intercepted communications between the Abu Sayyaf camp and contacts in Malaysia who were helping to coordinate ransom negotiations. The intercepts provided enough information for analysts to triangulate the approximate location of the camp within a few square kilometers of dense jungle. David was called into a special briefing at JSOC headquarters in Norfolk, where senior officers outlined the developing rescue plan. The room was filled with the kind of tactical experts who planned the most sensitive operations in the war on terror: intelligence analysts, mission planners, communications specialists, and senior special operations commanders. "We've identified a target area here," the briefing officer explained, pointing to a detailed topographical map of Mindanao. Satellite imagery confirms structures consistent with a semi-permanent camp, and signals intelligence places the hostages at this location with high confidence. David studied the terrain carefully. The camp was located in extremely challenging geography: dense jungle with limited access routes, surrounded by swampland that would complicate both insertion and extraction of rescue forces. The nearest road was over 10 kilometers away, and the jungle canopy would prevent direct helicopter landings near the target. "What's the proposed mission profile?" asked the JSOC colonel who was leading the briefing. "We're looking at a joint operation with Philippine Special Forces," the planner continued. "American advisors and intelligence support, Philippine operators on the ground. The political sensitivities require that any rescue attempt appear to be primarily a Philippine operation, even though we'll be providing most of the tactical capabilities." David understood the diplomatic complexities, but he also knew that mixing American and Philippine forces would introduce additional complications into an already difficult mission. Language barriers, different training standards, and unfamiliarity with each other's operational procedures could prove fatal in the split-second timing required for a successful hostage rescue. "Timeline?" the colonel asked. "We're looking at a window in approximately 1 week," the briefing officer replied. "We need time to position assets in the region, complete final reconnaissance, and coordinate with Philippine authorities. But we can't wait much longer. Intelligence indicates that Abu Sayyaf is growing impatient with the lack of response to their demands." As the briefing continued, David found himself thinking about Sarah and what she might be experiencing at that very moment. Was she maintaining hope? Was she staying physically and mentally strong? Had she been able to establish any rapport with her fellow hostages or even her captors? What David didn't know was that Sarah had indeed been busy during her captivity. Using skills learned during her humanitarian work in other conflict zones, she had been carefully observing the camp's routines, mapping the location of guards and weapons, and building relationships with the other hostages that might prove crucial during any rescue attempt. She had also been thinking about her brother David and wondering if his military training might somehow factor into her eventual rescue. Sarah didn't know about the specific planning underway, but she had begun preparing for the possibility that any rescue attempt would require her to take an active role in her own liberation. The irony of the situation was lost on neither David nor the mission planners. Abu Sayyaf had specifically targeted Sarah because of her connection to American Special Operations Forces, believing that this would give them additional leverage in their negotiations. But that same connection was now bringing the full weight of American military capabilities to bear on their jungle hideout. Commander Hassan had made a fundamental miscalculation. He had assumed that knowing about David's SEAL training would help him anticipate and counter any rescue attempts. Instead, it had provided American intelligence with detailed information about Sarah's background and capabilities, while also ensuring that her rescue became a top priority for Special Operations Forces. During the final planning stages, David was consulted extensively about his sister's likely behavior during a rescue operation. Would she remain calm under fire? Would she be able to follow complex instructions during a chaotic assault? Could she help protect the other hostages or even assist the rescue force if necessary? "Sarah's not going to panic," David assured the mission planners. "She's been in dangerous situations before, and she's trained in crisis response. If anything, she's probably already thinking about how to help with her own rescue." The planners incorporated this assessment into their tactical planning. Instead of treating all the hostages as passive victims who would need to be protected during the assault, they began developing a plan that anticipated Sarah might be able to assist with protecting the other captives or providing real-time intelligence about the camp layout. As the mission preparation entered its final stages, David received permission to record a brief message that would be transmitted to Sarah just before the rescue attempt. The message was designed to provide her with basic instructions about how to respond during the assault, while also reassuring her that help was coming. "Sarah, this is David," he said into the secure recording device. "If you're hearing this message, it means a rescue operation is about to begin. When it starts, get down immediately and stay down. Protect the other hostages if you can, but don't try to be a hero. We're coming to get you, and we're going to bring you home." The message would be broadcast on a frequency that intelligence had determined the militants used for their radio communications, timed to reach the camp just minutes before the assault began. It was a risky move that might alert the kidnappers to the impending rescue, but the psychological value of letting Sarah know that help was coming was deemed worth the risk. Meanwhile, the rescue force was making final preparations for what would prove to be one of the most challenging hostage rescue operations in recent memory. The combination of difficult terrain, unknown camp layout, multiple hostages, and heavily armed militants created a scenario where even the smallest mistake could result in disaster. What none of the planners fully anticipated was how dramatically the arrival of Navy SEAL training and capabilities would change the dynamics of the situation. Abu Sayyaf had built their reputation on the fear they could instill in governments and families through their willingness to use violence against hostages. They had never faced an enemy who had been trained specifically to overcome that fear and turn it back against them. The militants were about to learn the difference between inspiring fear and facing it when confronted by people who had been trained to operate effectively despite danger, uncertainty, and the possibility of death. David Martinez and his fellow operators represented a force that Abu Sayyaf had never encountered before, one that did not negotiate with fear and would not be deterred by threats against hostages. As the rescue force prepared for insertion into the Philippine jungle, David found himself thinking about a conversation he had with Sarah years earlier, before she had begun her humanitarian career. She had asked him what it was like to know that his job might require him to kill other human beings in defense of American interests. "It's not about killing people, Sarah," he had explained at the time. "It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. Sometimes that requires violence, but the goal is always to save lives, not take them." Now, as his sister remained captive in a remote jungle camp, those words took on a deeper meaning. The rescue operation would indeed require violence. There was no way to extract hostages from an armed militant camp without engaging in combat. But the ultimate goal remained exactly what David had described to his sister: protecting people who could not protect themselves. The final mission briefing was scheduled for the following morning. After that, there would be no more planning, no more analysis, and no more waiting. The rescue force would deploy to the Philippines, infiltrate the jungle, and attempt to bring Sarah and the other hostages home safely. David would not be part of the assault team, but he would be monitoring the operation from the command center, providing real-time consultation and intelligence support. For a Navy SEAL trained to take direct action against America's enemies, being relegated to a support role while his sister remained in danger was almost unbearable. But he also understood that this was exactly how the mission needed to be conducted: professional, methodical, and emotionally detached. Abu Sayyaf had made the mistake of believing that taking a SEAL's sister hostage would give them additional leverage over the American government. Instead, they had simply ensured that when the rescue came, it would be planned and executed with the full capabilities of the world's most elite special operations forces. The clock was ticking, and David Martinez was about to discover whether the rescue operation began 3 days later under the cover of a moonless night in the Philippine jungle. Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison led a 12-man team of Navy SEALs who had been specially selected for this mission based on their experience in jungle warfare and hostage rescue operations. Morrison himself had conducted over 40 combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, but he knew that rescuing hostages from a fortified jungle camp presented unique challenges that desert warfare had never prepared him for. The team had spent 18 hours infiltrating through dense tropical vegetation, moving in complete silence through terrain that seemed designed to prevent human passage. Every step required careful consideration. A snapped branch or displaced stone could alert sentries and doom both the rescue force and the hostages they were trying to save. Morrison carried a photograph of Sarah Martinez in his tactical vest, along with pictures of the other 3 hostages. David Martinez had briefed him personally about his sister's background and capabilities, emphasizing that Sarah was likely to remain calm under pressure and might even be able to assist during the rescue operation. She's not just going to curl up in a corner and wait to be saved, David had explained during their final briefing. Sarah's been in crisis situations before. If you give her clear instructions, she'll follow them. And she'll do everything she can to help protect the other hostages. Now, as Morrison and his team approached the final phase of their infiltration, that assessment was about to be put to the test. Intelligence had provided them with detailed layouts of the camp based on satellite imagery and signals intercepts. But the reality of the target was always different from what appeared on maps and photographs. The Abu Sayyaf camp was larger than the aerial surveillance had suggested, with more structures and more militants than intelligence estimates had indicated. Morrison counted at least 15 armed guards visible in the immediate area, with likely more positioned in concealed positions throughout the jungle perimeter. The hostages were being held in a bamboo structure near the center of the camp, surrounded by enough obstacles and potential cover positions to make a direct assault extremely dangerous. Morrison realized immediately that a conventional raid would likely result in hostage casualties, even with perfect execution. "Control, this is Neptune 1, Morrison whispered into his throat microphone, using the mission's code name to communicate with the command center where David Martinez was monitoring the operation. "Target assessment complete. We have a more complex situation than anticipated." Back at the command center, David felt his stomach tighten as he listened to Morrison's report. He could hear the tension in the team leader's voice, the careful professional language that special operators used when a mission was about to become significantly more dangerous than planned. "Neptune 1, this is Control," the mission commander responded. "What's your assessment?" "Hostage structure is more heavily defended than expected," Morrison reported. "Multiple guard positions with overlapping fields of fire. Direct assault would likely result in hostage casualties. Request permission to modify approach." David leaned forward in his chair, studying the real-time video feed from Morrison's helmet camera. The image was grainy and difficult to interpret, but he could make out the general layout of the camp and the bamboo structure where his sister was being held. "What kind of modification are you considering?" the mission commander asked. Morrison had been thinking about this exact scenario during the infiltration. Standard hostage rescue doctrine called for overwhelming speed and violence to neutralize threats before they could harm captives. But in this situation, the physical layout of the camp made such an approach nearly impossible. "I want to try a different approach," Morrison explained. "Create a diversion at the north end of the camp, draw their attention and their manpower away from the hostage area. Then, conduct a surgical extraction from the south while they're focused on the false threat." It was a risky modification to an already dangerous mission. Splitting the team would leave both elements more vulnerable, and creating an effective diversion would require exposing some of his operators to significant risk. But Morrison's experience told him it might be their only chance to extract the hostages without casualties. "Control, this is Martinez," David interjected, using his authorized call sign to join the conversation. "My assessment is that Sarah will recognize the sound of gunfire and understand that a rescue is underway. If you can get a message to her before you begin the diversion, she might be able to help protect the other hostages during the extraction." The mission commander considered this for several moments. David's input was valuable, but involving the hostages as active participants in their own rescue added additional variables to an already complex operation. "Neptune 1, can you establish communication with the hostage structure?" the commander asked. Morrison studied the target through his night vision scope. The bamboo walls would not provide much sound isolation, and he had equipment that could transmit messages on the radio frequency that intelligence had identified as being monitored in the camp. "Affirmative," Morrison replied. "We can transmit on their monitored frequency, but it will likely alert the entire camp that we're here." "Do it," the commander decided. Send the message. Then, execute your modified plan immediately afterward. Morrison activated his communications equipment and selected the frequency that Abu Sayyaf used for their internal radio traffic. He had memorized the message that David had prepared specifically for this moment. Sarah Martinez, this is Neptune Rescue Team. He transmitted in clear English. Your brother David sent us to bring you home. In 2 minutes, we will create a distraction at the north end of the camp. When the shooting starts, get all hostages on the ground in the center of your structure and keep them there until we come for you. Do you understand? Inside the hostage structure, Sarah heard the transmission clearly through a radio that one of the guards kept nearby for communication with the camp leadership. For a moment, she could hardly believe what she was hearing. A rescue team was actually here, and David had somehow been involved in planning the operation. The message galvanized her into immediate action. During her weeks in captivity, Sarah had developed detailed plans for exactly this scenario, thinking through how she would respond if a rescue attempt ever materialized. Now those plans would finally be put to the test. Klaus, Miguel, Antonio, she whispered urgently to her fellow hostages, American forces are here to rescue us. In 2 minutes, there's going to be gunfire at the north end of the camp. When it starts, we all get down in the center of the room and stay low until the rescuers come for us. Klaus looked skeptical. After months in captivity, he had stopped believing that rescue was possible. But Miguel and Antonio immediately began preparing themselves mentally for what they understood would be an extremely dangerous few minutes. How do you know it's real? Klaus asked. This could be some kind of test by our captors. Sarah's eyes flashed with determination. Because they knew my name, and they knew about my brother David. Abu Sayyaf doesn't know those details. Outside the hostage structure, the guard assigned to watch them had also heard the radio transmission. He began shouting in alarm to alert his fellow militants, grabbing his assault rifle and moving toward the door of the bamboo building. But Morrison's timing was perfect. Before the guard could take more than a few steps, the northern end of the camp erupted in gunfire and explosions as 4 SEALs launched their diversionary attack. The sound was overwhelming in the quiet jungle night, and the guard instinctively turned toward the apparent threat, just as Morrison had anticipated. The diversion was spectacular and terrifying. Morrison had positioned his operators to create the impression of a much larger attacking force, using carefully placed explosive charges and concentrated automatic weapons fire to simulate a company-sized assault on the camp's northern perimeter. Commander Hassan and most of his militants immediately responded exactly as Morrison hoped they would, rushing toward the sound of gunfire with their weapons ready. Within 90 seconds, the majority of the camp's defenders had moved away from the hostage area to confront what they believed was the main rescue force. But Hassan was not a fool. He had been fighting government forces for over a decade, and he understood that rescue operations often involved multiple elements approaching from different directions. As his men rushed toward the diversion, he grabbed 2 guards and headed directly for the hostage structure. If this is a rescue attempt, Hassan told his subordinates grimly, we will kill the hostages before allowing them to be taken. Morrison had anticipated this possibility as well. As Hassan and his guards approached the bamboo building, the SEAL team leader and 3 other operators emerged from concealed positions just 20 meters away. They had been waiting in perfect stillness for over an hour, positioned specifically to intercept any militants who might try to harm the hostages during the rescue operation. The engagement was brief and decisive. Morrison's team had the advantages of night vision equipment, superior training, and complete surprise. Hassan and his guards were neutralized before they could reach the hostage structure, but not before Hassan managed to shout a warning that alerted the remaining militants in the camp. Inside the bamboo building, Sarah heard the gunfire approaching their location and understood that the critical moment had arrived. She grabbed Miguel and Antonio, pulling them down to the floor in the center of the room just as she had promised the rescue team. Klaus, however, panicked at the sound of nearby combat. Instead of following Sarah's instructions, he rushed toward the door of the structure, apparently hoping to escape in the confusion. His movement caught the attention of a militant who had been running toward the northern diversion, and the man turned to investigate. Klaus, no, Sarah shouted, but it was too late. The German journalist stumbled out of the hostage structure directly into the path of an armed Abu Sayyaf fighter who was already on high alert because of the gunfire erupting throughout the camp. Morrison saw the situation developing and reacted with the split-second decision-making that had kept him alive through dozens of combat operations. The militant was raising his weapon to fire at Klaus, but Morrison had a clear shot that wouldn't endanger the hostages still inside the structure. The SEAL's suppressed rifle barely made a sound as it eliminated the threat, but Klaus continued running in blind panic toward the jungle. In the darkness and confusion, he disappeared into the dense vegetation before Morrison could stop him. "Control, this is Neptune 1, Morrison reported as his team moved toward the hostage structure. "We have secured the primary target area, but one hostage broke containment and is now mobile in the jungle." David felt his heart sink as he listened to the report. A hostage running loose in the jungle during an active combat operation was a nightmare scenario that could result in friendly fire casualties or capture by surviving militants. "Neptune 1, what's the status of the other hostages?" the mission commander asked. Morrison was already at the entrance to the bamboo structure, where Sarah had positioned herself to greet the rescue team. After weeks of captivity, seeing an American special operator was an almost overwhelming relief. "Sarah Martinez?" Morrison asked, though David's description had made her easy to identify. "That's me," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Miguel and Antonio are here with me, both uninjured." Klaus ran into the jungle toward the west. Morrison quickly assessed the two remaining hostages. Miguel was shaken but physically unharmed, while Antonio appeared to have maintained his composure better than expected. Both men would be able to move under their own power during the extraction. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to help keep these two gentlemen calm during our movement to the extraction point," Morrison told Sarah. "Can you do that for me?" Sarah nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. What do you need us to do?" Morrison's respect for Sarah increased immediately. Instead of being overwhelmed by her rescue, she was already thinking about how to help with the operation. David's assessment of his sister had been completely accurate. "We're going to move fast through the jungle to a landing zone about 2 kilometers south of here," Morrison explained. "Stay close to my operators, do exactly what they tell you, and if shooting starts again, hit the ground immediately." As Morrison's team prepared to move the rescued hostages toward their extraction point, the diversionary element was fighting a running battle with increasing numbers of Abu Sayyaf militants. The diversion had worked perfectly, too perfectly. More fighters were responding to the false attack than intelligence had indicated were present in the entire camp. "Neptune 2, this is Neptune 1, Morrison called to the diversion team leader. "Beginning movement to LZ with 3 hostages. What's your status?" "Neptune 1, we're heavily engaged," came the reply, punctuated by the sound of automatic weapons fire. Enemy strength was significantly underestimated. "We're going to need extraction support at the North LZ." Morrison realized immediately that the mission had become significantly more complicated. The diversion team was in serious trouble, facing more militants than they had planned for. But his primary responsibility was to get the rescued hostages to safety. "Control, this is Neptune 1, he reported to the command center. "Beginning movement to primary extraction site with 3 rescued hostages. Neptune 2 is heavily engaged and may require emergency extraction from alternate site." Back at the command center, David watched the situation unfold with growing anxiety. The mission was succeeding in its primary objective. Sarah and 2 other hostages had been rescued and were moving towards safety. But the diversionary team was now fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, and Klaus was missing somewhere in the jungle. "Neptune 1, this is Control," the mission commander responded. "Continue to primary extraction site as planned. We're vectoring additional support to assist Neptune 2. As Morrison led Sarah, Miguel, and Antonio through the dense jungle toward their rescue helicopters, the sound of gunfire gradually faded behind them. Sarah found herself amazed by the skill with which the SEALs moved through terrain that had seemed nearly impassable during her forced march into captivity. "Your brother wanted me to tell you something," Morrison said quietly as they navigated through a particularly difficult section of the jungle. "He said to tell you that Navy SEALs don't negotiate with fear." Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. That sounded exactly like something David would say. Her brother had always been protective of her, even when they were children. Now his training and his fellow operators had literally carried that protection to the other side of the world. "How is David?" Sarah asked, stepping carefully over a fallen log. The aftermath of the rescue operation stretched across multiple time zones, and government agencies as officials worked to manage the complex diplomatic and security implications of what had transpired in the Philippine jungle. Sarah Martinez found herself at the center of an international incident that would reshape how terrorist organizations viewed American hostages and how the United States responded to such threats. Her first stop after the helicopter extraction was Clark Air Base, a joint U.S.-Philippine military facility north of Manila, where she underwent comprehensive medical examinations and extensive debriefings with intelligence officers. After 3 weeks in captivity, Sarah was physically weak and had lost nearly 15 pounds, but her mental resilience impressed the psychologists who evaluated her condition. Most hostages require weeks or months to process their experiences. Dr. Rebecca Stone, the Air Force psychiatrist assigned to Sarah's case, explained during one of their sessions. "But you seem to have maintained remarkable psychological stability throughout your captivity." Sarah attributed her resilience to several factors: her previous experience working in dangerous environments, her confidence that her family and government would work toward her rescue, and her decision to remain actively engaged with her situation rather than retreating into psychological isolation. "I never let myself believe that I was helpless," Sarah explained to Dr. Stone. "I knew David would move heaven and earth to find me, and I knew the other hostages needed someone to stay strong and focused. When you have responsibilities to other people, it's easier to keep yourself together." Meanwhile, the search for Klaus continued in the jungles of Mindanao. The German journalist had disappeared during the rescue operation, running into the dense forest in a moment of panic that potentially cost him his freedom. Philippine military units, supported by American intelligence assets, were conducting systematic searches of the area around the former Abu Sayyaf camp. The militants themselves had scattered after the devastating raid that had killed Commander Hassan and most of his senior leadership. Intelligence indicated that surviving Abu Sayyaf members had broken into smaller groups, some fleeing toward the Malaysian border, while others melted back into local communities where they could hide among sympathetic populations. David Martinez finally spoke with his sister via secure video conference 3 days after her rescue. The connection was established in a private room at Clark Air Base, with Sarah looking tired but remarkably composed considering what she had endured. "You look terrible," was the first thing David said, causing Sarah to laugh for the first time since her ordeal began. "You should see the other guys," Sarah replied, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the jungle where the rescue operation had taken place. "Your friends made quite an impression on Abu Sayyaf." The conversation was both emotional and practical. David needed to hear from Sarah herself that she was truly safe and recovering well, while Sarah wanted to understand exactly how the rescue operation had been planned and executed. She was particularly interested in how her captors' knowledge of David's military service had actually contributed to their downfall. "They thought knowing about my background would give them an advantage," David explained. "Instead, it just ensured that your rescue became a top priority for Special Operations Forces. Commander Hassan made the mistake of thinking that fear works both ways." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. During her captivity, she had observed how the militants used intimidation and the threat of violence to control their hostages. But she had also noticed that they seemed genuinely afraid of American military capabilities, constantly worried about surveillance aircraft and potential rescue attempts. "They were always looking over their shoulders," Sarah told her brother. "They knew they were vulnerable, but they thought they could use us as shields to protect themselves. They didn't understand that targeting a SEAL's family member would actually make them bigger targets, not safer ones." The conversation also covered the difficult topic of Klaus's disappearance. Sarah felt considerable guilt about the German journalist's fate, wondering if she could have done something differently during the rescue to prevent his panicked flight into the jungle. "Klaus had been in captivity for months," David reminded her. "His psychological state was completely different from yours. You can't blame yourself for his reaction to a situation that would have terrified anyone." The The search for Klaus continued for another week before Philippine authorities located him in a remote village approximately 30 kilometers from the rescue site. The journalist had wandered through the jungle for days, surviving on stream water and wild fruits, before stumbling into a farming community whose residents helped him contact government authorities. Klaus was physically exhausted and severely dehydrated, but alive and uninjured. His experience highlighted both the dangers of panic during rescue operations and the remarkable fact that all 4 hostages had ultimately survived their ordeal with Abu Sayyaf. Sarah remained at Clark Air Base for 2 weeks, participating in extensive debriefings that provided intelligence agencies with detailed information about Abu Sayyaf's operational methods, camp structure, and leadership hierarchy. Her observations proved invaluable for planning future counterterrorism operations in the region. "You have an excellent eye for tactical details," Colonel Martinez told Sarah during one of their debriefing sessions. "Your descriptions of guard rotations, weapon storage, and communication procedures are giving us insights that satellite surveillance never could have provided." Sarah had spent her weeks in captivity carefully observing everything around her, partly as a survival mechanism, and partly because she had suspected that such information might prove useful if she were ever rescued. Her humanitarian background had trained her to notice patterns and assess situations quickly, skills that translated directly into intelligence gathering. The information Sarah provided led to several follow-up operations against remaining Abu Sayyaf cells in the region. Philippine forces, supported by American intelligence, conducted raids that captured or killed most of the surviving militants from the group that had held her hostage. The psychological impact of the successful rescue operation also discouraged other terrorist organizations from targeting American aid workers in the Philippines. During her final week at Clark Air Base, Sarah met with Master Chief Morrison and the other SEALs who had participated in her rescue. The meeting was arranged partly for operational debriefing purposes, but also because Sarah had specifically requested the opportunity to thank the men who had risked their lives to save her. "I want you to know that what you did changed more than just my life," Sarah told the assembled special operators. "Miguel has 3 children who have their father back. Antonio's family was facing financial ruin trying to raise ransom money. Klaus has a second chance at life. You didn't just rescue hostages, you prevented 4 families from being destroyed." Morrison and his team were moved by Sarah's words, but they were also impressed by her detailed recollections of the rescue operation itself. Her description of the final minutes in the hostage structure provided them with valuable lessons about how civilians might react during future rescue operations. "You kept your head better than a lot of trained soldiers would have," Morrison told Sarah. "Your brother said you'd be tough, but you exceeded even his expectations." The conversation also covered the tactical decision-making that had made the rescue possible. Sarah learned how the SEALs had modified their original assault plan based on the actual conditions they encountered, and how her compliance with Morrison's radioed instructions had been crucial to the operation's success. "The fact that you recognized our radio transmission as legitimate and immediately began preparing the other hostages probably saved all your lives," one of the other SEALs explained. "If you had panicked or failed to follow instructions, the extraction would have been much more dangerous." Sarah's return to the United States was carefully managed to minimize media attention while maximizing the intelligence value of her experience. She flew back to Colorado on a military transport, avoiding commercial airports where journalists might attempt to intercept her for interviews about her ordeal. The reunion with her parents at Peterson Air Force Base was intensely emotional. Her mother broke down completely upon seeing Sarah step off the aircraft, while her father maintained his composure just long enough to embrace his daughter before his own emotions overwhelmed him. "We never stopped believing you were coming home," her mother said through tears, holding Sarah as if she might disappear again at any moment. "David called every day with updates. He never let us give up hope." David himself was waiting at their parents' house, having taken emergency leave to be present for Sarah's homecoming. The reunion between brother and sister was profound in ways that went beyond their family relationship. Sarah's rescue had tested everything David believed about his profession and his commitment to protecting American citizens abroad. "You brought me home," Sarah said simply as she hugged her brother. "I knew you would find a way." David's response was equally simple and direct, Navy SEALs don't leave people behind, especially family. The weeks following Sarah's return involved extensive medical and psychological evaluations, continued intelligence debriefings, and difficult decisions about her future career in humanitarian work. Global Relief International was eager to have her return to active duty, but they also understood that her experience in the Philippines had fundamentally changed the security considerations for American aid workers in conflict zones. Sarah herself struggled with the decision of whether to continue working in dangerous regions. Part of her felt obligated to return to humanitarian work as a way of demonstrating that terrorists could not intimidate American aid workers into abandoning vulnerable populations. But another part of her recognized that her high-profile kidnapping and rescue had made her a symbolic target for other militant groups. "I can't let fear make my decisions for me," Sarah told her brother during one of their many conversations about her future. "But I also can't ignore the fact that my capture put other people at risk, not just the other hostages, but the military personnel who had to rescue us." David understood his sister's dilemma better than most people could. His own career involved accepting risks in service of larger purposes, but those risks were ones he had chosen for himself based on his training and capabilities. Sarah's humanitarian work involved similar purposes, but different kinds of risks, and her kidnapping had demonstrated how those risks could affect entire families and military units. The resolution came when Global Relief International offered Sarah a new position based in their Colorado headquarters, focusing on logistics and coordination for field operations rather than direct deployment to conflict zones. The role would allow her to continue supporting humanitarian missions while minimizing the security risks that had led to her capture. "You'll be helping more aid workers reach more people in need," the organization's director explained to Sarah during their meeting. "Your experience in the field, combined with what you learned during your captivity, makes you uniquely qualified to help other workers stay safe while still accomplishing their missions." Sarah accepted the position, recognizing that it represented the best compromise between her desire to continue humanitarian work and the practical realities of her situation. She would still be serving vulnerable populations around the world, but from a position that utilized her experience without exposing her to unnecessary risks. The broader implications of Sarah's rescue extended far beyond her personal situation. Abu Sayyaf and other terrorist organizations began to understand that kidnapping Americans with connections to military families might actually increase rather than decrease the risks they faced from U.S. forces. Intelligence agencies developed new protocols for responding to hostage situations involving military family members, recognizing that such cases might require different approaches than traditional kidnapping scenarios. The successful rescue also strengthened cooperation between American and Philippine forces, leading to expanded joint operations against terrorist groups in the region. Most importantly, the operation demonstrated that the United States possessed both the capability and the determination to rescue American citizens from even the most remote and dangerous locations. This message was not lost on terrorist organizations worldwide, many of which began to reconsider the risks and benefits of targeting American civilians abroad. 2 years after her rescue from the Philippine jungle, Sarah Martinez had rebuilt her life in ways that honored both her commitment to humanitarian work and the realities of living in a world where her experience had made her a symbol of American resilience against terrorism. Her new position with Global Relief International had evolved into something far more significant than either she or her employers had initially envisioned. Operating from the organization's headquarters in Denver, Sarah had become the architect of a revolutionary new approach to humanitarian aid security. Her first-hand experience with kidnapping, combined with insights gained from her brother David's military expertise, had led to the development of protocols that were now being adopted by aid organizations worldwide. Traditional security approaches focus on avoiding dangerous areas, Sarah explained during a conference presentation to representatives from dozens of international humanitarian organizations. But vulnerable populations are often located precisely in those dangerous areas. We need security strategies that allow aid workers to operate safely in high-risk environments rather than simply avoiding them. The protocols Sarah developed emphasized several key principles that had emerged from careful analysis of her own kidnapping and rescue. Advanced communication systems ensured that aid workers could maintain contact with security personnel even in remote locations. Detailed risk assessments helped organizations understand local threat patterns and time their operations to minimize exposure to hostile groups. Most importantly, comprehensive contingency planning meant that if aid workers were captured, rescue operations could begin immediately rather than after weeks of failed negotiations. Sarah's approach had been tested in practice multiple times over the past 2 years, with consistently successful results. Aid workers operating under her security protocols had been able to reach populations in Syria, Somalia, Afghanistan, and other conflict zones that had been considered too dangerous for humanitarian operations. In the few cases where workers had been threatened or briefly detained, rapid response procedures had secured their release within hours rather than months. The transformation in Sarah's professional life was matched by changes in her personal relationships and perspectives. Her experience in captivity had deepened her appreciation for family connections, particularly her relationship with David, who had taken a new assignment that kept him stationed in Virginia rather than deploying overseas. Having Sarah kidnapped changed my perspective on risk, David admitted during a family gathering at their parents' home in Colorado. I'd always accepted that my job involved dangers that could affect my family indirectly. But experiencing how directly those dangers could impact the people I love made me think differently about the choices I was making. David's new role involved training other special operations personnel in hostage rescue techniques, using lessons learned from Sarah's rescue and other recent operations. The assignment allowed him to contribute his expertise to future rescue missions while maintaining closer connections to his family. The relationship between brother and sister had evolved as well. Sarah now possessed first-hand knowledge of the kinds of operations David had conducted throughout his military career, while David had gained deeper appreciation for the risks that humanitarian workers faced in their efforts to help vulnerable populations. "We're both in the business of protecting people," Sarah observed during one of their regular conversations. "David does it through military action, and I do it through humanitarian aid. My kidnapping showed us both that those missions are more connected than we had realized." The broader impact of Sarah's rescue extended throughout the counterterrorism community, where her case had become a study in how personal connections between terrorists and military families could actually work against the kidnappers' interests. Intelligence agencies now tracked such connections as a factor in predicting how terrorist groups might respond to rescue operations. Master Chief Morrison, who had led Sarah's rescue, found himself frequently called upon to brief other units on the tactical lessons learned from the operation. The mission had demonstrated several important principles about jungle warfare and hostage rescue that were being incorporated into special operations training programs. The Martinez rescue showed us that we needed to be more flexible in our planning, Morrison explained to a group of SEAL trainees during one such briefing. Standard assault procedures didn't work in that environment. We had to adapt our tactics in real time, and we had to trust that the hostages would be able to adapt as well. The operation had also highlighted the importance of understanding hostage psychology and capabilities. Sarah's ability to remain calm under pressure and follow complex instructions during the rescue had been crucial to the mission's success, leading to new training programs that helped operators better assess and utilize hostage capabilities during rescue operations. Klaus, the German journalist whose panic during the rescue had nearly cost him his life, had also drawn important lessons from the experience. After his eventual rescue and return to Germany, he had written extensively about the psychological challenges of captivity and the importance of mental preparation for anyone working in dangerous environments. "I thought I was prepared for the risks of conflict journalism," Klaus wrote in his book about the experience. "But nothing had prepared me for the psychological impact of prolonged captivity or the split-second decisions required during a rescue operation." Sarah Martinez saved my life twice, first by keeping me focused during our weeks as hostages, and then by creating the conditions that allowed the rescue team to find us. Miguel, the Filipino driver who had been captured alongside Sarah, had returned to his family with a new perspective on the international implications of local conflicts. His experience had led him to become an advocate for improved security cooperation between Philippine authorities and international aid organizations. "Before I was kidnapped, I thought the conflicts in Mindanao were purely local problems, Miguel explained during an interview with Philippine television. But being held hostage with people from other countries showed me that these conflicts affect people everywhere. When terrorists target aid workers, they're really attacking all the people those workers are trying to help. Antonio, the Filipino businessman whose family had struggled to raise ransom money, had used his experience to establish a foundation that provided security training and insurance coverage for Filipino professionals working with international organizations. His foundation had already helped dozens of local employees avoid kidnapping situations through improved security awareness and communication procedures. The long-term impact on Abu Sayyaf and other terrorist organizations had been significant and measurable. Intelligence indicated that several groups had changed their targeting strategies, avoiding American citizens with military connections and focusing instead on what they perceived as softer targets from countries with less robust rescue capabilities. Ironically, this shift in targeting had made American humanitarian workers safer while potentially endangering aid workers from other nations. Sarah's organization had responded by sharing their security protocols freely with international partners, recognizing that terrorist attacks on any humanitarian workers ultimately threatened the entire aid community. We can't be satisfied with making only American aid workers safer, Sarah argued during discussions about expanding her security programs. If we develop effective protection methods, we have an obligation to share them with everyone working to help vulnerable populations. This principle had led to the establishment of the International Humanitarian Security Consortium, an organization that Sarah helped found to coordinate security efforts across national and organizational boundaries. The consortium provided training, equipment, and rapid response capabilities to aid workers regardless of their nationality or organizational affiliation. The consortium's most innovative program involved creating regional response teams that could coordinate with local military forces to conduct rescue operations when aid workers were kidnapped. These teams included former special operations personnel from multiple countries, intelligence analysts, negotiation specialists, and medical personnel trained in hostage psychology. We learned from Sarah's case that the key to successful rescue operations is speed and coordination, explained Colonel Sarah Williams, a British Special Forces veteran who directed the consortium's rescue operations. The longer hostages remain in captivity, the more dangerous rescue becomes for everyone involved. Sarah's personal journey had also involved extensive therapy and reflection on the psychological impact of her experience. Working with Dr. Stone and other specialists, she had developed coping strategies that allowed her to process her trauma while continuing to work effectively in high-stress environments. Surviving captivity doesn't mean forgetting about it or pretending it didn't affect you. Sarah explained to other former hostages during support group meetings she helped facilitate. It means integrating the experience into your life in ways that make you stronger rather than more. For David Martinez and his fellow SEALs, the mission represented validation of years of training and preparation for exactly these kinds of scenarios. They had proven that American Special Operations Forces could successfully conduct complex rescue operations in challenging environments against determined enemies. Every mission we train for comes down to bringing Americans home safely, David reflected during a conversation with Master Chief Morrison after the operation. When it's your own sister, the stakes feel different, but the job remains the same. Sarah's rescue had demonstrated something that Abu Sayyaf had failed to understand when they targeted her for kidnapping. Navy SEALs and other American Special Operations Forces don't negotiate with fear because they represent something more powerful than fear. They represent the commitment that no American will be abandoned to terrorists, regardless of where they are held or how dangerous the rescue might be. The lesson was clear. Terrorists who target American citizens are not just challenging individuals or families. They are challenging the entire military and intelligence apparatus of the United States. And that apparatus, as Commander Hassan and his followers learned too late, does not accept defeat when American lives are at stake. He's monitoring this operation right now, Morrison replied. He's been working on your rescue since the moment he learned about your situation. You've got quite a brother. 20 minutes later, they reached the extraction landing zone, where American helicopters were waiting to carry them to safety. As Sarah climbed aboard the aircraft that would take her away from her weeks of captivity, she could still hear the distant sounds of combat as the diversion team fought their way toward their own extraction point. The rescue operation was not yet complete, and Klaus remained missing in the jungle. But 3 hostages were safe, and Abu Sayyaf had learned a hard lesson about the consequences of targeting American citizens with connections to the U.S. military. As the helicopter lifted off and began its flight toward the safety of a U.S. military base, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that her ordeal was truly over. David had been right. Navy SEALs really didn't negotiate with fear. Instead, they had traveled halfway around the world to bring her home. Years of training and all his faith in his fellow operators would be enough to bring his sister home alive. Rother is in the military, yes, but that doesn't mean he has any special resources or authority to negotiate my release. Hassan smiled coldly. On the contrary, Miss Martinez, your brother's unit specializes in exactly the kind of operations that might be used to attempt a rescue. This makes you considerably more valuable to us, but also more dangerous. The commander paused, studying Sarah's reaction carefully. We will be contacting your government soon with our demands. But I want you to understand something very clearly. Any attempt at rescue will result in the immediate execution of all hostages. Your brother's training makes him a threat to our operations, which means we must be prepared to eliminate that threat permanently. As Hassan walked away, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the jungle humidity. She had thought her brother's military service might somehow help her situation, but instead it had made her captivity infinitely more dangerous. The militants now viewed her not just as a valuable hostage, but as a potential target for military action. What Sarah didn't know was that thousands of miles away, David Martinez had already been notified of his sister's kidnapping. The Navy SEAL was not just aware of the situation. He was actively working to do something about it. And Hassan's assumption that involving a Navy SEAL would make their operation safer was about to prove catastrophically wrong. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Sarah had learned about survival, everything her captors believed about controlling their enemies through fear, and everything David Martinez had learned about bringing his fellow Americans home safely.